welcome everyone to the Vashon Heritage Museum Talks, our talk on Vashon birds, past, present, and future. I'm Ilse Kroonquist, the Executive Director of the Heritage Museum, and I want to remind everybody that your microphone is muted for this talk as you join us. And if you have a question, please type it into the chat function, and we'll answer all the questions at the end of the presentation. Also, it's always asked, is this going to be recorded? We always record our talks, and it will be on our website, vashonheritagemuseum.org, by the middle of next week. I'd like to recognize at this time and say a big thank you to For Culture for sponsoring this museum talk series. Chris, could you change to the next slide, please? At this time, I will introduce Chris Austin, who is a Heritage Museum board member, co-host of this museum talk, and host of our radio show, History Worth Hearing. Chris will tell us a little bit about Lucy Durand, a notable person in Vashon history, and acknowledge the first Vashon Native people through reading our land acknowledgement statement. Next slide, and Chris.
Well, thank you, Elsa. Just a little bit about Lucy Durand. She was born in Vashon in 1936, and she was instrumental in the late 1920s for educating anthropologists about the way of life the Native people had on the island. She testified at the Native Reclamation Trials in 1927, which gave us our fullest look on how life was, where people lived, where they fished and got their resources. She died in 1929, was buried on Vashon in an unmarked grave until 2008, when the Puyallup tribe honored her with a gravestone. So now let me do the acknowledgement. The Vashon Heritage Museum stands on the ancestral lands of the Shwabaks, or Swiftwater people, who inhabited Vashon Maury Island for millennia. The Donation Land Claim Act encouraged large numbers of Euro-American settlers to claim this land, even before the Medicine Creek Treaty of 1854 extinguished Native claims to it. The Shwabaks were forcibly removed and relocated onto nearby reservations, including Puyallup, Nisqually, Squaxin Island, and Muckleshoot. We acknowledge the people of the Puyallup tribe whose stewardship of and relationship with Maury Island, Vashon and Maury Island continues today. We commit to amplify the voices of Indigenous people, making space for them to tell their own story, both past and present, in our exhibits and programs. Thank you, Elsa.
Thank you, Chris. So, and now our our Vashon Heritage Museum Inclusion Pledge. Next slide, please, Chris. The Vashon Maury Island Heritage Museum rejects racism, discrimination, and hate. Our purpose is to honor stories of love, oppression, action, and resilience. Stories that give voice to all, examine hard questions about social, economic, and environmental justice, and reveal racism and oppression within our heritage. We pledge that everything we do will honor the island's diversity of cultures and histories. And now the next slide. We would like to invite everyone to the museum to view and listen to our new mini exhibit, which is produced in partnership with the Audubon Society, on Vashon birds and their songs. And this colorful exhibit will be up now through the end of April. And then join us in April, right here, when we will present a panel discussion of Vashon potters to include the history of Akio Takamori and potters through the 70s, 80s, and today. In May, we will host Michael Mead as he talks about the importance of preserving stories and myths in our society. And the next slide, Chris. So tonight, we present a panel discussion of Vashon birds, past, present, and future. Our panelists will take a look at how human impact through changes in land use and climate change have affected Vashon bird populations over the past 150 years. Tonight's moderator, Adria Magrath, as a Master's of Science, is the current Vice President of the Vashon Maury Island Audubon Society, a biology professor, naturalist, mom, and farmer. She has completed Ed Swan's Advanced Birder class series and regularly hosts Vashon Audubon's programs on Zoom. Our panel, Rayna Holtz, has served as the Conservation Chair, newsletter editor, and president of the Vashon Audubon Society, and has worked on the Landmark Tree Committee. Currently, Rayna is helping with a project to replace the old Quartermaster Harbor Important Bird Area sign with a new one looking at what has gone wrong and how it can help the harbor recover. Rayna is a retired librarian, and she now volunteers for the Vashon Heritage Museum's Collection Committee. Thank you very much, Rayna. She works in the garden and walks the woods and beaches, trying to learn more about Vashon's native heritage. Ed Swan is a writer, guide, and avid birder. As a child, he learned to enjoy the birds from his grandmother and continued growing his passion as an adult. Ed refined his building techniques through decades of observation, identification, and field practice. As an accomplished master birder, he observes and records species around the world. Ed writes about the natural history of birds. As editor of Washington Birds, the Journal of the Washington Ornithological Society, he curates literature for the Pacific Northwest. His sentinel work, The Birds of Vashon Island, A Natural History of Habitat Transformation, documents the natural history of birds and habitat transformation over a century. Welcome, Adria, Rayna, and Ed.
Thank you, Elsa, for that introduction. With kind of some basic backgrounds with Rayna was instrumental in the start of Vashon Audubon Society. So Rayna, could you please share with us about the beginnings of Audubon on Vashon and who joined you to form it?
Sure. The main instigator was Emma Amiad. And I think probably what had happened is that she had moved to Vashon several years earlier and found that it was really a long night when she was traveling back to Seattle for the meetings and the field trips. And so she, of course, called up the longtime Seattle Audubon Society secretary, the famous Hazel Wolf, and said, you know, it's really about time. We've got enough Audubon members on Vashon. We got to have our own chapter out of here. And this is one of the things that Hazel loved to do. She's kind of legendary for starting chapters. So she came out and met in one person's home with all of the members who were at that time members of other chapters. And everybody was very enthusiastic. Of course, it didn't take long for Emma to just go through a couple of sets of bylaws that Hazel supplied, and we were off and running with there were a lot of great birders already, lifetime birders like John Fryers and Dan Wilsey. So,
what motivated you, the group, to start a brand new chapter on Vashon Audubon? Because it sounded like that they were members of other chapters already.
Yeah, I think that people really wanted to study birds right here and become familiar, have strong birders showing us what was right here and bring the focus closer, as well as making it easy to go to the monthly meetings because they would be right here. And had projects in mind. I mean, the very first year, Wanda Fink started the 4th grade birding program. When I looked back and realized it, because I know that's still going on. It's gone on without a break all this time, over 30 years. And it was the very first year that it was Susan Smith and Susan White and Eugene Smith who put their heads together and started the Landmark Trees Committee. And that really took off. Nancy Silver is published a book about it that's online through the Audubon website. So there were a lot of people who had, interests that didn't really have a chance to flower until we had a local chapter.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, this is
Yeah.
a lot of known mythology with Audubon folks and people who are involved with Audubon and Vashon. But I know that there's a lot of non-Audubon people here tonight who are excited to learn about Vashon birds. And so it's really interesting to hear about the start of this Vashon Audubon Society. And this was in 1989, if I remember correctly, right?
1989, yeah.
1989. And one of the fourth grade birding program was one of the first programs that you worked on?
I think it's one of the first two, kind of outside of the regular meetings and field trips, that and the formation of the Landmark Trees Committee. Although there were a whole bunch of committees that got set up, like there was a recycling committee that immediately got really busy. They wanted better recycling facilities at the landfill. They wanted to start recycling at the schools. They wanted to adopt a road. I mean, and they just took off and started a bunch of things.
So there sounds like they're really active in a lot of community activities and interests. Do you have a lot of active members to start with?
Well, I don't have a good sense numerically, but I went back and found a list of members that was from 2007, and we had 180 households then, which would be more people because some of them are multiple people in the household. But there were at least 100 people involved, I think, early on.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What were some of some of the most significant accomplishments in those early days that you're most proud of?
I think the counts rate pretty high. We did an unofficial count when the chapter was about 2 months old in December of 1989. And then the real Christmas bird counts didn't start until it was 1998 with Sutra Bathan. And I feel like those counts are really valuable when we try to do what Ed Swan does with his book, and look to see what's happening with our bird populations, because then you can compare year to year and kind of see trends happening and differentiate them from one-time big eruptions or, odds and ends of things. We started a breeding bird survey as well when Candy Dean joined us. That was really important to her. Let's see, that one was started in 1995, and Carol Elder, who was quite a strong birder, did that for many years until she left Vashon. And that kind of gives you an idea of what the breeding birds, the summer birds who come here to breed, were.
Okay. So a breeding bird survey of the summer breeders that would come to Vashon to breed specifically, not the resident breeders, but the summer. Both,
all the breeding birds. There's
okay.
The Christmas bird count. A lot of those guys have gone south.
Yeah.
But in addition to the counts, great classes were started, and then like the birding by ear and the basic birding class, which now you have to. There are classes that Steve Caldwell led for many years in basic birding, and Dan Wilsey's basic birding class morphed into classes by quite a few talented people. And then I think for me, the number one most interesting project that we did was the Vashon Stream Survey, because it's another of those things like the counts that kind of provides a baseline. And it's something that I hope will get updated at various points and we'll be able to look back. This is something that we did back in 2000 and 2001. And
okay.
the stream map was necessary because we were getting calls, the board people were getting calls from neighbors who were concerned about sediment washing into local streams because, somebody would be developing They would just bulldoze right to the water. There would be no vegetation buffer. And then they would build without buffers. And when we were talking about it at a board meeting, we happened to have Tim Cullinan present, who was at the Washington chapter. He was part of Washington chapter, and he was doing outreach to local people. He was sitting there and saying, well, I know just what you guys should do. You should contact my friends at Washington Trout, because the stream types need to be upgraded to what they actually are on the ground. He said, all of the government protections extend to the streams according to their types. The types have been determined in a very superficial way by simply looking at topographic maps. You need somebody to walk the streams and say, this is type 1, type 2, type 3. And we followed his advice. And it's become the Wild Fish Conservancy right now. But Audubon people led them to the individual streams and watched what they did. They were taking temperature, oxygen levels. They were measuring width and depth. They made notes of any kinds of blockages to the stream. They photographed, they had electric shockers so they could photograph the streams at various points and see how far up the stream they were finding fish and what the species were. And all of that stuff is keyed into the map. I called because I couldn't find the map online, and they sent me a link. It's now called the Wild Fish Conservancy. It's changed name, but they still have our map. And what they're doing is they're upgrading all of their stream maps to a better platform. I guess the old HTML is not the quality they want.
Right.
And temporarily ours is not on their main website because they haven't worked their way back to it yet. They're kind of starting up here and working backwards, but they sent us a link. It's online. It's just not on their website. And we'll have that for you in a slide.
Yeah, would you want to share that website? People can go and look at that information.
Slide up right now?
Can you put that up, Chris? Yeah, it sounds like you guys were doing more than just work with Vashon birds, but a lot of Vashon local environmental issues, and even doing some of the surveying and providing this really important information to these institutional bodies that are in charge of regulating this. Yeah,
it's all tied together, and when it's amazing how a bunch of energetic people can just get things done.
That's right. That's really amazing. Something to be proud of.
Yeah.
And I know that 4th grade birding program has continued to this day. It's a really fantastic program, and we continue to be really proud of it currently on Audubon Society. Harsey Parker was really instrumental in taking that forward for many years. And right now, Vashon Audubon is actually partnering with the Vashon Nature Center. So currently this year. So it's an exciting partnership to continue to program. That's great. So thank you so much, Rayna. It's really fantastic information about the origins of Vashon Audubon and some of the people who started it and some of those initial projects. And my understanding is that Ed was also president of Vashon Audubon Society, I believe right after Rayna in the mid 2000s. Is that correct, Ed?
Yeah, it's right after Rayna, and probably would have been the mid 2000s to 2009 or 2010.
Oh.
Somewhere in there.
And when did the first edition of your Vashon birds, when was that the first edition printed?
You know, I think that came out in maybe 2005 or so, and then the second edition in 2013.
Okay. So as early as 2005. And, you know, this book that you've put together, Ed, is really, really fantastic. It is such an amazing resource that has been such a great teaching and learning tool, and an accessible resource for people who move to the island and want to learn about the birds that are here, and where to go visit them. I'm really interested in learning what inspired you to write this book to begin with.
Well, I have been interested in birds since I was a kid, and then over time as an adult, I became more and more interested in the environment that birds are in, their habitats, and slowly I was writing columns for the Vashon ticket at the time, before it was the Vashon Loop. Slowly I started morphing those columns about the birds of Vashon to also about habitat on Vashon, and about how the different quality of the habitat and the different types of habitat made a difference into what birds we were seeing on the island. And then with you know, we were really lucky. I was lucky coming in when I did that. There were many people. There were so many people that had been birders when they were young, and they could remember back to as early as the 30s and 40s about what things were like on the island then, and what birds were there. And I just kind of started really getting interested in history as well, and the history of what birds were here. And I was thinking, well, why were those birds here? One of my favorite birds are Western bluebirds, and they're so pretty and colorful. And I think of them as being in Eastern Washington. And so you go to Eastern Washington to see the bluebirds, and they were really common on Vashon, and they nested on Vashon at one time, and I was blown away by that. And so over time, I really got interested in, well, how did that happen? And so that's kind of how the book came about. I began to write a series of columns about why we have the birds that we do now, and why were there some birds that you wouldn't think of being on Vashon? Why were they here in the past, and why aren't they here now? And slowly the book came together.
Interesting. Well, I think we're curious to learn a little bit about some of the history of habitat change on Vashon, and how that has affected some of the birds that we do have here. I understand you're gonna talk a little bit about
I
that.
will, and I'm going to share my screen now, so hopefully that will work correctly. And
I don't want to take away any of your hurrah.
there we go. So are we seeing just a slide there?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Good. Great. So in writing the book, and then in the years since, I've just come to realize we have, through the Historical Society and through other sources of information, there's just a treasure trove of information and history about about Vashon and its habitats, and about birds, so that we can get a fairly good look at what changes have occurred over time. And I found that I now use this book as a key part of the class that I teach, the Advancing Birder, because the context of birds, their habitat and their season and their range, that context, the history of habitat change will tell you what kind of species that you're going to have. And it's a core part of, if you're interested in birds, learn about habitat and learn about the history of it. And one of the nice things as well is Vashon is very well documented. And if you can talk about Vashon, and Vashon's experience is very similar to the experience that all of the lowland Puget Sound went through. So that if you look at Vashon's history and Vashon's habitat change, you're looking at the same changes across the region.
Okay.
And let's see. There we go. It's so here, this is a map of the regional habitats, and you'll really be able to, when you take a look at the types of habitats in a region, that will really tell you what birds are going to be there. And what the definition of habitat is it's where a species meets its basic needs for food, water, and shelter within the correct climate and environmental conditions. And it's very important because every species has preferences. And you have some species like robins that are generalists, and they like, you can see robins down on the seashore, and you can see robins up on the edge of the alpine area. Other specialists, other birds are specialists, like the spotted owl or marbled murrelet, and they are dependent on a specific type of forest, old growth forest, as we had it here in the Pacific Northwest. And those birds would have been on Vashon, and as I'll talk about, they would have become extinct because all of the old growth forest habitat is gone now.
Right, that makes sense, right? You're dependent upon that old growth habitat, and that old growth habitat goes away, then so would they.
Exactly. So here's a chart of the basic look at habitats and the history of habitat change over time on the island. And the first parts is the Native Americans came thousands of years ago, and Rayna was just sending me some links yesterday where it may be even into the maybe more 10,000 years ago or something. I thought it was more like 5, but they came to the island, and they did make some changes. The original Vashon was old growth forest from shore to shore. It was almost uniformly old growth forest, and so you didn't see several different types of forest types or many different types of trees like we do now in any part of Vashon. We basically saw we saw Douglas fir, western hemlock, and then the western red cedar in different mixes depending on soil and water on different parts of the island. And the Native Americans made some initial changes where they opened up a few areas to a couple of tens of acres, where they burnt those areas regularly so that they could have ferns and berries and hunting area. But those areas were um, very small percentage of the overall island, so that the island was mostly the old growth forest. And so then there weren't also, prior to the Euro-American settlement, there weren't any pond. There's only maybe one natural pond, and there were some kind of wetland areas, but no real open water. And so
Fresh water, no, open fresh
yeah,
water.
fresh water, that's correct. Yeah. And so so mainly what we had were the birds like the Pacific wren and varied thrush and birds like that like the forest, the coniferous forest. And then all of a sudden, about in the 1870s, the first logging got going. And by the beginning of World War I, about 30 years later, 40 years later, the whole island had been cut from shore to shore.
Mhm.
And I think there's now, Rayna might know better, but I think now there's maybe 3 or 4 trees that exist that are older than European American settlement, but all the rest were cut down. And so there's a few pictures where you can see for miles across the island, for all that you can see, basically all the way to the horizon across the island. And then so what happened is the numbers of forest bird species obviously fell. And if there were probably birds like the spotted owl on the island, and they would have been eliminated. We don't have any records of them, but if they were there, they would have been eliminated. And what came next is that agriculture replaced much of that, and then lots of growing back areas. But agriculture was 2/3 of the island. And that's when all of a sudden birds that liked the open area, like western bluebirds, western meadowlarks, mourning doves, all sorts of birds that you think of being in Eastern Washington became common breeders on the island. And that is actually well documented from a few ornithologists that have visited the island, and various in the literature to some extent, and then also with, at the time, still living people that I was able to interview. And so there was,
I understand lazuli buntings also did very well.
yeah, those birds at that time. So when we're looking at the 1920s and 30s, at that time, the American goldfinch, the pretty bright yellow birds that we see all over the place in the summer and sometimes at our feeders in the winter, those birds were very uncommon to rare in Western Washington. And after all of the logging occurred, what came next were weeds like thistles and other types of weeds that with lots of seeds. And that's when the goldfinches came in, and then in the shrubby areas, all the new thickets that started to grow up. That's where you saw the lazuli buntings coming. And so we saw a whole new set of birds come. Other birds that we had, barn owls came, joined the, they like the open area, they like agricultural areas.
Barn owls.
Barn owls. Not our barred, BARRED.
Right.
Those owls came later because of all the habitat change, but barn owls, short-eared owls that like open air areas, many, about 20 to 30 species of birds. The American kestrels came and were common, and
What do kestrels like to eat, Ed?
and they like little, they like bugs, like they like big grasshoppers, and they like little voles and mice and things as well.
That's why they'd like the agricultural fields.
Yeah, and other things that changed were the farmers, the settlers came in and built lots of ponds, Fisher Pond and Mukai Pond, Ernst Pond, all these ponds that we have now. There wasn't any open water, and so those ponds were added in, and so a lot of birds got, like the wood ducks. You wouldn't have seen wood ducks on Vashon before. You wouldn't have seen the ringneck ducks that come. You would have seen bufflehead out on the saltwater, but now you could see bufflehead in ponds, and that was a change. And then they also brought pheasants and California quail, and I'm forgetting the
These
name,
are
the
these are game birds for the hunters.
game
right,
birds
that they
that
would
were
do
introduced.
on the island.
And when
Okay,
there
so
was the
they're small
habitat,
birds.
the large open habitat area for them, they were introduced, and then their populations just expanded and were huge, and they were very common. And so that was the first big wave of changes. Is a lot of the forest birds declined, and then the many different other birds came that liked open areas.
Interesting. My understanding is also red-tailed hawk also benefited from that.
Yes, the more they like open areas and edge area, and now there were lots of open area and lots of areas where that hadn't been cut yet or were growing back,
Mhm.
and then were cut again. Here's some of, and you'll see that many of the photos I use in the book I was able to get from the Historical Society and the Vashon Memorial and Heritage Association, and there's just an incredible amount of good photos of what things used to be like.
Interesting. I really like too how you described a little bit about the creation of a Fisher Pond, and how these freshwater ponds didn't exist before, and they've even seen a lot of change themselves, that it was at one point emptied and then refilled again. That's
Yes,
changing the birds that you would find there over time.
And then we had another whole wave of change happen, is that eventually there were economic factors that made it so agriculture didn't work as well on the island. And then as agriculture faded, forests started to regenerate. But what we had before was old growth forest, and old growth is forest that's at least 500 years old. It's reached the climax of changes over time that a forest goes through. And so by definition, the new forests were not old growth. We have on the island now, there are many different types of forests. There's broadleaf forest, there's coniferous forest in areas, and there's a lot of forests that are mixed. We have some of the best example of the evergreen broadleaf forest, which is the Pacific madrona tree. And that we've had some of the largest madrona forests in the Northwest here on the island. And so now there's several different forest habitats, each of which have their own assemblage of birds that like that. So we probably have many more warblers and flycatchers and many more different kinds of thrushes and wrens and things now, depending on what type of forest there is.
Would you say that we have a greater diversity now than maybe we may have had historically?
I do think we do have a higher diversity. So we lost one habitat that we won't regain, and because of that, there's some species that we lost, but other species have come in to replace them. What we're seeing now is on the land, we're much more diverse, and we're probably seeing with the land birds that it's not only more diverse, but many of those species have been doing fairly well. Though as the forest came back, we got more forest species, but the birds I was talking about earlier that like the open areas, like the bluebirds, the meadowlarks, the lazuli buntings, all of those have stopped breeding on the island, and we only see them briefly in spring migration. And like with Western bluebirds, we're lucky to see them every other year. And so there's a few places, the Matsuda Reserve is where they're noted the most. And the meadowlarks are mostly seen in more migration just along the shoreline. So we've lost a lot of those birds again. And so as each habitat change occurred, some species benefited, other species lost out, and so that history makes a difference. As each habitat change occurs, it has a corresponding effect on both species diversity and also in the numbers of any given species. And as far as the water habitat, it's still, so we have, now we have some freshwater birds. On the saltwater area, it's still saltwater, but the big change there in that habitat is that water quality has gone down. Habitat features of the saltwater area, the near shore, the amount of eelgrass has gone down that supports things like the herring and other species. And we've seen also massive overfishing of basically all of the fish species that birds depend on. And I'm wearing a Western grebe t-shirt here. The Western grebes that were the reason that Quartermaster Harbor became an important bird area when Dan Wilsey was censusing them. They were, and Quartermaster Harbor in the 80s had 10% of the population of Western grebes wintering there, in 10% of the Northwest population of Western grebes just in Quartermaster Harbor. And because the herring population has crashed and the other prey species have crashed around Vashon and Puget Sound in general, now the population of most of the diving waterfowl that go after fish have fallen by 95% is the figure for Western grebes. Other grebes are in the 80s to 90%. Most of the loon species are down by 80 to 90%. Are different types of scoters and goldeneye, their populations have fallen by 50 to 80% over since the 1980s.
Yeah, I
And-
was gonna ask the time
Yeah,
skip.
so it's since the 1980s when there was a baseline count done. And so, for example, the first Vashon Christmas bird count, I think there were 2,000 Western grebes counted, and in Quartermaster Harbor. And in the last several, I started going on the, I came to the counts for starting in either 99 or 2000, and we still had several hundred, but every year it fell until the last several years we've had no Western grebes.
Yeah.
And so that's a history of habitat change right there for the water species. That's quite severe.
Yeah. And I want to share with folks, actually, I'm going to put a website in the chat here. This is a website here. You can actually see the Vashon Christmas bird count data results over time. It is now being managed by Ezra Parker, and he dedicates a lot of time, and he does an amazing job coordinating this and putting all the data together. And you can look at that website and you can see trends. He compares percentages over time. So everybody can see that website in the chat right now. Thank you for talking about that, because that's a really important message that currently we're seeing such extreme downturns, and it's really quick as well. It's happening in a very short period of time. We have 26 species on Vashon Island alone that are considered highly vulnerable to climate impacts that we are at risk of losing altogether. And this is according to Audubon, the National Audubon Society. And the National Audubon website has really good information about that if folks wanted to look up their favorite bird on Vashon, that they like on Vashon. If you go to the National Audubon website and look up your favorite bird, you can actually see how its range is probably going to change, how our best guess is with climate change.
Shall I stop sharing my screen there? Yeah.
I don't know. Do you have something else you would like to share there, Ed?
I think I'd be glad to be part of questions and
That's great. That's great. That's
so I don't
what
babble
I
on
thought
forever.
was really nice there. So I would love to so yeah, I would love to be able to open it up to questions. This has been really great talking with Rayna about the beginning of Audubon Society and some of the initial programs that they started, like this Christmas bird count, and you did the summer breeding surveys, in these stream surveys, the 4th grade birding program, and all of these things have been extremely instrumental for understanding the natural world here on Vashon. And the birds really are the canary in the coal mine for us with climate change and going forward. So I have a question in the chat about why did the bluebird and meadowlark population diminish, given that there are still open spaces?
Because not only did this happen on Vashon, where there were lots of open spaces, but across the lowland Puget Sound, it went from being lots of open spaces, lots of habitat for them, to being much less. So down the open space on Vashon now is, I just got rid of that slide, but it's down to about 10%. So
Right.
it just got to be where sometimes there's a critical mass that's needed, and it just got below their critical mass of needed habitat all across the region, and they need
Interesting.
a pretty good amount of space. The only place that they're doing really well still in Western Washington, ironically, is Joint Base Lewis McChord, where because it's a military base that they kept open and undeveloped, there's habitat very similar. There's habitat that they need, and they were probably there. Actually, that habitat existed there prior to settlement, and so they've managed to stay there, but it's too small on Vashon now.
Interesting. Someone was also asking if you thought the herring were to return.
I think it's possible. Some of the decline is that there's been an actual decline in overall numbers of Western grebe, so that the Western grebe as a whole, as a species, is having a hard time. But some of it is that they're going to other areas where they're finding more food. If they started finding more food here again, some of those might shift. Some of the birds that have left might shift back to here.
Interesting. What kind of warblers do we see on somebody? Kate is asking about warblers that we can find on Vashon.
The really common ones that you'll find are orange-crowned warblers that you'll see around in the shrubby edges and in your yard, in shrubby areas of your yard, and Wilson's warblers that will be on the edges of woods or in little openings in woods. Those are some of the two of the most common ones that come here to breed. And then in migration, you'll definitely see in April, especially, you'll see lots of yellow-rumped warblers.
Thanks.
In winter, you can, if you get lucky, sometimes at your feeders, you'll see a Townsend warbler, and sometimes they like to come and eat sunflower seeds, which is kind of strange. Or the other thing to do is to put out a suet feeder, and they'll come to suet during the winter.
I have seen Townsend's at a suet. Townsend's warbler to suet.
And
feeder.
I've seen them on a hummingbird feeder as well.
Interesting.
So that's only a few times.
And yellow-rumped warblers, sometimes are the easiest ones for me to find, because certain trees that they really like, habitat, like you said, connecting that habitat. And so if you know where that habitat is, you can find yourself a yellow-rumped warbler.
They really like a lot of species, but especially the yellow rumps, like the madrona trees. They like the flowers, and they like feeding around the flowers and around the berries. I don't know if they're actually eating or getting any of the syrup, not syrup, but the nectar from the flowers, or eating the berries. But they definitely like to forage there.
Interesting. Charles asks, have ravens displaced crows on Vashon? And what is the biggest surprise that you've had about Vashon birds?
I don't think ravens have displaced them. I think that they've that with people not shooting birds as much as they used to, that ravens have come back a lot more. And they also ravens do like horse country a lot. They like a lot of different habitats, but they do like being around farms and things. And so there's a lot of farms around the island that they might like. So I think that's part of their return to Vashon. I don't think that they've affected the crow population at all. And I'm trying to think of biggest surprise. It's hard to it's hard to say. Just there's just there have been I think one of the biggest surprises is just about that the Matsuda Preserve, and what a crazy hotspot that is. And Eric, I'm forgetting his last name, that lives there, that helps watch over the preserve, knows birds. And so it's amazing to see what shows up there. And that's a place where you can go and see. That's a place where, when I first moved to Vashon, you'd see a few ravens. That's a place where you can see upwards of 50 ravens at a time. But that's also where the bluebirds migrate through. And we've had some really unusual rarities there, like red-shouldered hawk and white-tailed hawk, tailed kite, and some unusual flycatchers. Just some real rarities show up there.
And this is the land trust. Land Trust now owns this, the farmland that's just behind or just west of
K2.
the K2 building, right? Yeah, Bob Keller actually wanted to know if there was any advice that you could give on locating flycatchers.
Well, let's see. I think probably your best place to go in the spring to around Mukai Pond, and then you can see and hear 4 species of flycatchers there. You can hear olive-sided and western olive-sided flycatchers, willow flycatchers, Pacific slope, and western wood pewee. And Hammond's flycatchers go through as well, but it takes, you need to learn to know their calls and the difference between that and the Pacific slope to do that. That's a little bit more of a challenge.
Okay. Pamela asks if you could speak about the decline and resurgence of eagles and osprey on the island.
That one is due to 2 factors: outright persecution, so that a special law had to be passed for bald eagles because they were the national bird and one of the images of the country. And so a law was passed to make it illegal to shoot them. But basically raptors in general used to be shot out of hand. And the osprey, even though they fish, they were just shot as well. So that's a big part of it. And then a really significant piece was the control of DDT use, because DDT got into the food chain And with the raptors, it made it so that their eggs, the shells of their eggs became very thin, and they would lay them and they'd land on the nest and their eggs would break. And so peregrine falcons almost became extinct in North America because of that. And bald eagles and ospreys are some of the species that really bounced back because of that. And then one of the things that's really interesting about that story is the bald eagles bounced back, and then possibly because other prey sources like salmon were no longer there for them, they began to prey on great blue herons, and they've had an effect on nesting great blue herons on the island. It's very rare to non-existent in the last couple of decades for the herons to have a successful nest on the island before it gets raided by a bald eagle. And I don't see anything about that in the literature.
Can I say a few things about that? Yeah.
Did you want to say something about that, Rayna?
Yeah, I was on the land trust when we were trying to protect the biggest blue heron nesting area that had been developed on Vashon. It had gone.
What was this?
This was in the mid 90s, and
Where was it on the island?
in the middle of Maury Island,
Okay.
east of the golf course, in that area, kind of right in the middle of the big forested area between 204th and whatever the next big street is. In any case, there were 130 nests, and about 100 of them were active in 1993 and 1994. And we talked to other people. There were only about 6 or 8 really big heronries that size in Western Washington. And then we found out it was a subspecies that's really only from mid-California up through British Columbia. It's a different subspecies than is on the east side of the mountains. And in British Columbia, they were suffering from predation by eagles, and that happened down here at the same time. And shortly after we obtained the properties where the nest trees were, the eagles started coming in and taking eggs and chicks, and the numbers just crashed. And then the heronry was abandoned by 98. And for a long time, people kept reporting in where they were seeing nest trees, and there were at any given year for about the next 5 years, there would be a small heronry of 5 to 8 nests, one place or another, near water usually, and then went down to 1 tree here and there. And now they're not being reported, but in the mid 90s, you could see during the fledging time, when herons don't chase each other off the beach, you could see, I think we counted 30 herons on from Jensen Point. You could look across the water and around the vicinity and see as many as 30 herons feeding side by side, basically. And I'm excited to see one anymore.
Interesting. That's really interesting to hear about that historical rookery and the challenges that they face.
Yeah.
Well,
But
I noticed that it's about 8, but we have a get through. So if you guys don't mind staying for a few more minutes and answering some questions, is that okay with you, Ed?
Yes, I can stay for a bit longer.
Yeah, we've got a few more questions. And kind of related to that habitat question. Someone was asking if we know about the effect seabirds around Vashon on the loss of the kelp forests in the Salish Sea. Is there a connection there for seabirds on Vashon that we're aware of?
I would imagine that there is some connection there as well, primarily for around Vashon, I think it's mostly the biggest effect is probably, I think the biggest effect is probably the crash in the fishing, the various fishing populations, but
The forage fish populations.
but like the eel grass, I'm not sure how many like kelp beds there are, but like the eel beds are definitely less. Again, I'm not sure how much. I don't have any data on that, and there might be others that do. I just don't.
Okay. What do you think?
There is a dramatic decline in kelp beds. I've talked to a number of fishermen who had favorite kelp beds, one off the north end of Vashon and big ones along the west side that have really, the one in the north end is completely gone and the west side is shrunk down. And I think the state DNR has been surveying that stuff. And there's a study I saw that.
Do you know how that connects to seabirds, Rayna? Do you know seabirds that are impacted by that?
Yeah, I don't know which birds. I know that because of the protection and all of the things that grow, the big kelp blades, that they provide a certain amount of hiding place and protection for smaller fish that are feeding on the critters that live.
Yeah.
So it's a loss to those seabirds.
What do you two think the most crucial or critical habitat needs? If money wasn't a question, bird habitat on the island, where do you think the focus should be on improvements?
I think the land trust would like to know that too. Yeah, I've been thrilled that there's been this collaboration between King County and the person of Greg Rayburn, groundwater management guru, and the land trust to try to protect shoreline places for all of the diversity of birds that are that need the shoreline. And it kind of protects the habitats that meet the water. So you have the water, the shoreline, and then the forested habitat above. And you can get 3 kinds of habitat at once by protecting those shorelines. And in turn, that helps protect the quality of shoreline beaches. The armoring is really terrible for all the shoreline creatures. Mm-hmm. And once you can protect that, they've taken out a number of houses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's been a really big active.
The shoreline to recover.
So Rayna thinks shoreline habitat is the most critical. What do you have anything to add, Ed?
I'd have to agree there, though. I wonder what's going to happen with sea level rise to all that work, if it's going to make it all moot. I'd have to agree about the short, just agree with everything that Rayna had to say, and then the focus on streams that the land trust has had, and the water quality and habitat along the streams, and then as far as assisting diversity, I think like having protecting the open area there at the Matsuda Preserve has been, I think it's just been amazing seeing. I used to know Miyoko and go birding there a little bit with her, and actually place some bluebird houses there before, when she still lived there. But I wasn't there enough. I never saw any of these things. And now that that's open to the community, and Eric Steffens is there paying attention, it's amazing the kinds of things that are seen there on a regular basis that there isn't the habitat elsewhere, except for around wax orchards. So that kind of open area where it's possible to preserve it, but it's hard, because then how do you keep it open without it being taken over by Scotch broom and blackberries
Burning.
and stuff?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I'd have to agree with both of you as well. I feel like that interface between land and water, whether it's freshwater streams, those riparian zones, or those shoreline areas, those are some of the most crucial habitat areas. They're richer in bird species, and they're some of the areas that have been heaviest impacted as well with development and habitat loss. Apparently there's a rumor, and somebody asked if there's any truth to this, that about pelican rookeries. I have never heard of that. Have you? Yeah, I don't think
no.
there's any truth to that rumor at all,
And
Linda. I'm
it's,
sorry.
yeah.
Yes.
So pelicans have recovered as well. The brown pelican was an endangered species, and I don't think it's on the endangered list anymore because of the DDT issues, the same issues with DDT. And so now we're seeing pelicans again, but there's no records of pelican rookeries in Washington, brown pelicans ever. There are white pelicans breeding in Eastern Washington.
In Washington, yeah. And I'd like to say that anybody wants to confirm or deny any bird rumors on the island, they just need to pick up a copy of Ed's book. If you're curious if pelicans are breeding on the island, it would tell you. And the DDT, somebody mentioned about eagles not being, and that would be connected to the DDT issue. Ed?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Somebody mentioned about the eagle population, how there was no eagles in the 60s. Is that related to the DDT issue?
Yeah. So when I was a kid in the late 60s and 70s, it was a big deal to see a bald eagle. And I remember calling it into the rare bird hotline that Seattle Audubon had. And probably actually kind of late in the time period where it was no longer that unusual, but still they were unusual. Now it's easy to see them, and that's because of their population rebound from DDT. So that it kind of started in the mid to late 70s and then really accelerated in the late 80s.
Interesting. Thanks. That's really great to get some context on that. Bob,
what's interesting is I was gonna, on the great blue herons and bald eagle interaction, what's interesting now is, so that at first the bald eagles, when their population got really big, it really had the huge impact that Rayna described. But now they're starting to reach an equilibrium with the great blue herons, where there's been some studies. I saw a paper recently where a bald eagle moved its nest that was right in the middle of a heron rookery, and it moved its nest a couple of miles away, and the great blue herons moved their rookery to where the new bald eagle.
I think that was Point Roberts, wasn't it? Right up at the border.
Yeah, it's somewhere up in BC.
Yeah, I think it was the biggest heronry in the state. I read that. I thought.
And now
the
herons are figuring that the bald eagles take a few, but they fight off all the other predators, so that so that it's a tax that they pay to get, it's a protection racket now.
Like the mafia.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But they've reached kind of an equilibrium. I thought that was very interesting.
Oh, that is
Yeah.
very interesting. So in this case, the herons actually followed the eagle.
Yeah. So they were willing to each take a small percentage chance of predation from that eagle against a great against the eagle keeping everything else out.
Interesting. Like a livestock guardian dog that takes a bite every now and again. Bob Keller was asking about some of those open spaces that we still have on Vashon. You know, we've got some of these big open spaces, these like radio tower parcels that we have. And is there anything that these parcels, these birds that use the open spaces, like bluebirds or meadowlarks? Because he mentions he's seen a meadowlark at the King Towers this winter.
Oh. I've seen flashlight buntings there. Are those the towers that are down there by on Maury Island at the I don't know which there's several, but I've seen some birds using the edges. I haven't really seen much use of the open area. The open areas being used that much, but I don't know how much those areas have been birded as well. But
due to be more attractive to those types of birds?
yeah, I'm not sure why. Some of them are quite large, so that it seems like it could. Maybe if people put some bluebird boxes along there, it might be worth a try, or other types of bird, especially maybe for the swallows.
Well, I think that's it for the questions in the chat there.
I think that's it for the questions, and I would like to just come back on and say thank you very much for Adria and Rayna and Ed for tonight's presentation. We went way over, and I appreciate your staying on and answering questions. This recording will be on our website by mid next week where everybody can see it. And I think with that, we'll just say good night. And remember to come by the museum and see the wonderful exhibit that we have with the birds.
Absolutely. Come see the mini pop-up exhibit. It's a wonderful video that Sarah Driggs has put together of Vashon birds. It's local photographers, there's images and 30 local photographers, and it's accompanied by the bird sound, so you can learn the songs of the birds. And it also talks a lot about habitat change and bird change and climate change. It's a really great exhibit. And it's through the whole month of April, right, Elsa? From 1 to 4, Wednesday through Saturday, is that right?
Wednesday through Sunday, 1 to 4. And we even have a bench where you can sit and listen, which is what I do daily because it's pretty wonderful.
Excellent. Is it now through April? Is that right?
Right. It opened first Friday, this last first Friday, and it's through the end of April.
Yeah. To the end of April. So this month
Right.
and next month. Okay.
2 months. Okay. 2 months. That's right. There's a lot of thank yous coming in. I don't know if you can see it or not. So on that note,
yes.
Unless there's anything else you want to add, I think we'll say good night.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody for joining.
Thanks, everybody. Very fun.
Good night.